All right, I am going to be reading from The Symbolism of Evil by Paul Ricoeur, Ricoeur. He is a French philosopher, and he writes. I found him from Rene Girard. He had quite good things to say about him in a very specific part of his book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And I picked up this book, and it's been really great. So I want to read from a chapter entitled, let's see, what was it? The Adamic Myth, the Eschatological Vision of History. So the Adamic Myth and the Eschatological Vision of History. There's a subsection here, and it's going into the details of a kind of an interesting analysis of Adam and Eve. And I'm going to kind of read from there. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Guys, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the work that I'm doing. I really appreciate it. And we'll just get started here. So here's a quote, good little paragraph that I posted, and I got some good feedback on. So I'm going to read it real quick. So hence, it is false that the Adamic myth is the keystone of the Judeo-Christian edifice. It is only a flying buttress articulated upon the ogival crossing of the Jewish penitential spirit, with even more reason, original sin being a rationalization of the second degree, is only a false column. The harm that has been done to souls during the centuries of Christianity, first by the literal interpretation of the story of Adam, and then by the confusion of this myth about original sin, will never be adequately told. In asking the faithful to confess belief in this mythico-speculative mass and to accept it as a self-sufficient explanation, the theologians have unduly required a sacrificium intellectus, where what is needed was to awaken believers to a symbolic superintelligence of their actual condition. See, I thought that was a pretty neat quote there. All right, so starting in the subsection I'll be reading from is entitled The Structure of the Myth, the Instant of the Fall. So let us try now to understand the structure of the myth by beginning with its intention, suggested by the primary experience of sin. The Adamic myth is narrated by the Yahwist editor of Genesis 3, obeys a twofold rhythm. On the one hand, it tends to concentrate all the evil of history in a single man, in a single act, in short, in a unique event. That is how St. Paul understood it, quote, as by one man's sin entered into the world, end quote. By this extreme contraction of the origin of evil into one point, the biblical account emphasizes the irrationality of that cleavage, that deflection, that leap, which tradition, not without ambiguity, has called the fall. On the other hand, the myth spreads out the event in a quote-unquote drama, which takes time, introduces a succession of incidents, and brings several characters into the action. In being extended in time and scattered among several roles, the drama gets a turbid ambiguity which contrasts with the frank rupture of the evil intent. Let us try to comprehend this dialectical play between the event of the fall and the space of time of the temptation. One man, one act. That is the first schema of the myth, which we have called the schema of the event. One man, the chronicler called the Yahwist in biblical criticism, found the idea for him in a myth which it was no doubt very primitive and which may even have had a very different meaning. The myth of the first man, or rather of a first pair driven out of a wonderful garden because they had disobeyed a taboo. The myth is very old, but its significance is new, and that significance comes to it from a retrograde motion in the understanding of history that starts from contemporary history as a nucleus. It would seem that the myth was seized upon in the course of meditation on the origins of the chosen people and annexed to the meditation through the intermediary of a folklore in which the different ethnic groups are represented by a single family, by a single ancestor. The time of the patriarchs before Abraham points in its turn to a still older time in which all the eponymous ancestors of all the people sprang from a single pair who would be to the whole of mankind what each patriarch is to the whole of his people, namely the founding ancestor of a great family now broken up into many peoples with many languages. That chronicle of the first man furnishes the symbol of the concrete universal, the model of man exiled from the kingdom, the paradigm of the beginning of evil. In Adam, we are one and all. The mythical figure of the first man provides a focal point at the beginning of history for man's unity in multiplicity. The first man, in his turn, is summed up in one act. He took the fruit and ate it. About that event there is nothing to say. One can only tell it. It happens, and henceforth evil has arrived. About the instant as a Sishra, one can only say what it ends and what it begins. On the one hand, it brings to an end a time of innocence. On the other, it begins a time of malediction. This reference of the instant of the fall to an innocent past, to a paradise which is spoken of only as lost, is secured by the insertion of the story of the fall into a story of creation. And here is the footnote here from that part there. So a lot of great footnotes in here. This isn't very long, so I'm going to read from the footnotes. So I take for granted the result of the textual criticism which, since Gunkel in 1900 distinguishes two sources underlying the present story of the fall, and thus accounts for the doublets and inconsistencies of our story concerning the status of Adam before the fall, the place of the fall, the role of the two trees, the nature of the curses, the role of the various protagonists. There are discussions of the problem in Paul Humbert's book. It's written in German here. The distinction of two traditions, two sources, or two different documents should serve to improve our understanding of the two different of the two stories as it has come down to us in its final compilation. The question of sources should prepare the way for the question of meaning. That is why I try to incorporate in the meaning of the story itself the tension that I try to incorporate in the meaning of the story that comes from the concurrence of the two sources according to Paul Humbert. Okay, and it goes on here. I'll just continue here back to the text. In virtue of that preliminary myth, the first sin appears as the loss of a prior mode of being, as the loss of innocence. The creation story with which our story of the fall is integrated is not the admirable story by which our Bible opens, and which is articulated around the following verses. Quote, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. End quote. This story is the fruit of a long maturation. Yahweh had to become the master of universal history before he could be recognized as the master of the earth and the heavens without any risk of his being confounded with the natural force. But before he could be acclaimed as the master of history, Jewish thought had to integrate the terrible ordeal of the national destruction and exile. The older story that we read in the second chapter of Genesis antedates that catastrophe and the greater depth in religion that resulted from it. And so it is of a more rudimentary make. We need only compare it to the creative act of 2:7 with that of 1:26. Nevertheless, this myth is not negligible. For if we may believe Mr. Humbert, whose interpretation I adopt here, it entailed a view of man that was suppressed by the Yahwist editor, but not so completely that we cannot discover some traces of it in certain manifest doublets of chapter 3. It seems that the story of creation placed man, and here's where we're going to get into the heart of it here. The story of creation placed man at his first appearance, not in the center of a garden in the midst of a steppe, Eden, but on the soil, the Adama, from which man, Adam, was drawn. He cultivated that soil industriously and intelligently. Furthermore, the man of the first story must have been an adult, sexually awakened, for he cries out in exultation in the presence of his new companion, quote, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, Iska, because she was taken out of man, Isk." End quote. The Yahwist would seem to have suppressed all the traits of discernment or intelligence connected with the state of innocence, and to have assigned all of man's cultural aptitudes to his fallen state. The creation man becomes for him a sort of child man, innocent in every sense of the word, who had only to stretch out his hands to gather the fruits of the wonderful garden, and who was awakened sexually only after the fall and in shame. Intelligence, work, and sexuality, then, would be the flowers of evil. This discrepancy at the heart of our story is of great interest. Far from leading us to consider the suppressed myth as a residue and a survival, it invites us to interrogate the tension between the cultural and the sexual implications of creation and the implications of the fall. The fact that there are two interpretations of civilization and of sexuality is by itself full of meaning. Every dimension of man, language, work, institutions, sexuality, is stamped with the twofold mark of being destined for the good and inclined toward evil. This duality is spread out by the myth in mythical time, just as Plato, in the myth of the Politicus, supposes a succession of two periods of the cosmos, the movement forward and the movement backward, which we experience in the inextricable melange of the temporal intentio and distentio. The ambiguity in man, created good and become evil, pervades all the registers of human life. The power of naming all beings, which is the royal prerogative of a being created scarcely inferior to God, is so profoundly altered that we now know it only under the regime of division, of idioms, and separation of cultures. Likewise, if we compare the sober description of innocence with the more explicit enumeration of maledictions, we see the opposition of the two ontological regimes invading the other aspects of the human condition. The nakedness of the innocent pair and the shame that follows fault express the human mutation of all communication, marked henceforth by dissimulation. And the footnote for dissimulation here is, quote, "Thus clothing sums up all the dissimulations that make social life possible, and not only the precautions taken to avoid sexual excitation." Quote, "The language of the story, so discreet, indicates an ambiguity and a constraint invading all the relationships of human life." All right, back to the text here. Work ceases to be joyous and becomes toilsome, placing man in an attitude of hostility toward nature. The pain of childbearing darkens the joy of procreation. The conflict between the woman's seed and the serpent symbolizes the militant and suffering condition of freedom, henceforth a prey to the guile of desires. Compare with Genesis 4:7. Even death is altered. The curse is not that man shall die, quote, "For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return," end quote, but that he shall face death with an anguished awareness of its imminence. The curse is the human modality of dying. Thus, the whole condition of man appears to be subjected to the rule of hardship. It is the hardship of being a man which, in the striking brevity of the myth, makes manifest his fallen state. Thus, the anthropology of ambiguity issues from the myth. Henceforth, the greatness and the guilt of man are inextricably mingled, so that it is impossible to say, here is the primordial man, there is the evil result of his contingent history. This ambiguity, this twofold reference of human quote-unquote nature to its original destination and to radical evil, stands out in high relief in the case of the divine interdiction. The Yahwist's account presents the interdiction, quote, "But of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat," end quote, as if it were a structure of innocence. That seems surprising at first. Is not life subject to prohibitions, to the law that represses the passions and thus excites them? Precisely the life of the sinful man. St. Paul gave striking expression to the experience of being cursed by the law in the sort of spiritual autobiography which we find in Romans 7:7-14, and which we have commented on above. Quote, had said, thou shalt not covet, but sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just, and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. End quote. Such is the dialectic of sin and the law, which Luther and Nietzsche also knew well. How then can an interdiction belong to the order of innocence? No doubt we must understand that in making man free, God gives him a finite freedom. The finiteness of that freedom consists in the fact that it is a freedom primordially oriented not, of course, by what he called value, but by what we call values, which are already much elaborated cultural products, but by a hierarchical principle of preference among values. This ethical structure of freedom constitutes the authority of values in general. Perhaps that is why the Yahwist, who elsewhere relates the crime of Cain and who therefore knows the gravity of murder, retained the naive motif of the forbidden fruit, which may have had a different meaning in the older legend. In the new and peculiarly Hebraic myth, the forbidden fruit stands for prohibition in general. Compared to murder, eating forbidden fruit is a peccadillo. This is a long footnote number 8. J. Coppens has tried to restate the problem of the knowledge of good and evil. He rejects the idea of omniscience or divine knowledge as well as the idea of a purely human judgment. The important thing, according to him, is the sudden eruption of evil into knowledge, more precisely its addition to the good in a, quote, combined, intermixed, additive, cumulative knowledge, end quote. It is not a discriminating or exhaustive knowledge, but a cumulative knowledge of good and evil. To this first thesis, he adds a second, that guilty knowledge is related to sexuality. Far from being a peccadillo, a childish fault as far as its object is concerned, and a mortal sin only because of the relation to him who forbids, the fault of Adam has a particular content. Is not Eve punished in her life as woman and mother? Is not man punished in his life of desire? But above all, the triangle formed by Eve, the serpent, and the tree suggests a fault of this kind. The serpent is the symbol of the gods of vegetation. Without being the representative of sex as such, he represents the temptation of the divinities that sacralize sex. Coppens is even more precise. The fault must have to do with the only commandment reported in Genesis before the fall, the command to procreate. Thus, the serpent would represent the temptation to place sexual life under the influence of the licentious pagan cults, and so to surrender to its dissoluteness. And in the same collection, Analecta Luvinis Biblica Orientella, it must be said that Coppens rests his interpretation on a vast and solid inquiry concerning the significance of the serpent as associated with divinities of vegetation. But in my opinion, he passes too quickly over the question whether it is really the existence of sexual transgression that the sacred author teaches. When he encounters this question, which ought to dominate the discussion, he answers in the negative. Quote, does the sacred author teach the existence of the sexual transgression of which we have spoken? I think not. The development of the theme is muted. It was much clearer, I think, in the source known to the author. The hagiographer dropped the theme, but there remain some traces of it which must be made out as in a palimpsest. Or one may suppose that he did not abandon it entirely for his own part, but that he abstained from inculcating it. He may have contented himself with insinuating it, either because he preferred not to rend the veil or because he deliberately made it thicker. These remarks that was the end of the quote. These remarks make me think that the sexual interpretation is a recessive interpretation of the sin of Adam. If it belongs to the most archaic level, the editor has suppressed it, not in order to conceal the meaning, but in order to say something much more important. It seems to me that the intention of the text is to reduce the content of the fault to the extent of making it a peccadillo, in order to emphasize the fact that man has broken the filial dependence that united him to his father. That is why, finally, the question of the tree is not important, as Zimmerelli has clearly seen. The decisive argument, in my opinion, is the place of this story at the head of the series formed by Genesis 1:11. The sin of Adam is the first in the sense that it is at the root of all others. Adam breaks with God as Cain separates himself from his brother, and the men of Babel are confounded. We shall take up this problem again in Book 3 when we examine the psychoanalytic interpretation of guilt. It will then be possible to discover the positive value of the sexual interpretation, and to assign Coppin's interpretation to its right place, which is not that of intentional instruction. All right, back to the text. Hence, the monstrousness of the act as such is less important than the alteration of the relation of trust between man and God. In this sense, it may be said that in taking up the myth of the tree and its fruits in this new theological context, the Yahwist demystifies the old theme of the magic potion, the magic fruit. He demystifies it by calling the fruit, quote, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, end quote. These two words, quote unquote, good and evil, place the hidden meaning far beyond any magic, at the very foundation of the discrimination between being good and being evil. What is forbidden is not this or that, but a state of autonomy which would make man the creator of the distinction between good and evil. There is more to be said. For an innocent freedom, this limitation would not be felt as an interdiction, but we no longer know what that primordial authority contemporaneous with the birth of finite freedom is. In particular, we no longer know what a limit that does not repress but orients and guards freedom could be like. We no longer have access to that creative limit. We are acquainted only with the limit that constrains. Authority becomes interdiction under the regime of fallen freedom. That is why the naive author of the biblical story projects into the state of innocence the sort of interdiction that we experience after the fall. The God who says, yes, let there be light, and there was light, now says, no, as for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat. The fall is at the same time a fall of man and a fall of the law. As St. Paul says again, quote, the commandment that was to give me life has led me to sin, end quote. Thus the fall is a caesura, cutting across everything that makes man human, everything sexuality and death, work and civilization, culture and ethics, depends on both a primordial nature lost but yet still lying there underneath, and an evil which, although radical, is nonetheless contingent. If now we ask the meaning of that innocence, which the myth projects as a before, we can answer. To say that it is lost is still to say something about it. It is to posit it in order at least to cancel it. Innocence here plays the role of the Kantian thing in itself. It is thought of to the extent of being posited, but it is not known. That is enough to give it the negative role of a limit in relation to the pretensions of the phenomenon to be coextensive with being, to posit the world as that into which sin entered, or innocence as that from which sin strayed, or again in figurative language, paradise as the place from which man was driven, is to attest that sin is not our original reality, does not constitute our first ontological status. Sin does not define what it is to be man beyond his becoming a sinner. There is his being created. That is the radical intuition which the future editor of the second creation story, Genesis 1, will sanction by the word of the Lord God, quote, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," end quote. The Imago Dei, there we have both our being created and our innocence, for the quote-unquote goodness of the creation is no other than its status as creature. All creation is good, and the goodness that belongs to man is his being the image of God. Seen retrospectively from the point of view of sin as a prior state in mythical language, the likeness appears as an absence of guilt, as innocence, but his goodness is altogether positive. It is sin that is the nothingness of vanity. Thereby the possibility arises of interpreting the two states of innocence and sin no longer as successive but as superimposed. Sin does not succeed innocence, but in the instant loses it. In the instant I am created. In the instant I fall. In the instant I am created, my pristine goodness is my status as a created being, but I do not cease to be a created being unless I cease to be. Therefore, I do not cease to be good. Then the event of sin terminates innocence in the instant. It is in the instant, the discontinuity, the breach between my having been created and my becoming evil. The myth puts in succession that which is contemporaneous and not to be contemporaneous. It makes an earlier state of innocence terminate in an instant that begins the later state of accursedness. But that is how it attains its depth, in telling of the fall as an event, springing up from an unknown source. It furnishes anthropology with a key concept, the contingency of that radical evil which the penitent is always on the point of calling his evil nature. Thereby the myth proclaims the purely historical character of that radical evil. It prevents it from being regarded as primordial evil. Sin may be, quote-unquote, older than sins, but innocence is still older. The anteriority of innocence to the oldest sin is, as it were, the temporal cipher of a profound anthropological fact. By the myth, anthropology is invited, in the first place, to gather all the sins of the world into a sort of transhistorical unity, symbolized by the first man, then to put the stamp of contingency on that radical evil, and finally to preserve, superimposed on one another, the goodness of created man and the wickedness of his historical man, while separating the one from the other by the event which the myth tells of as the first sin of the first man. That is what Rousseau genially understood man at its, quote, naturally good, end quote. But we know him under the regime of civilization, that is to say, of history, only as depraved. Above all, that is what Kant understood with admirable rigor in the essay on radical evil. Man is destined for the good and inclined to evil. In this paradox of destination and inclination, the whole meaning of the symbol of the fall is concentrated. All right, that is the end of that section. Hope you guys liked it. It was kind of dense there for a little bit, but to me it was interesting, and it's kind of working out how the root of evil is both found in man, but also found in prior to man, and it's contingent. So, guys, let me know what you think. Thanks for listening.